Yo, what's going on everybody? My name is Dominic, and today I'm going to be making a video on why I love Jean-Luc Godard's Breathless. If that sounds interesting, let's get right into the video. Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Dominic from the channel Dominic Talks Movies, and today I'm continuing the Why I Love series. I've renamed this already twice in the two videos I've made, one about bicycle thieves, one about playtime, and I think I'm just going to go with a simple Why I Love because this is basically just a series about gushing about some of my favorite movies and why I love them so much, and there you go, that's why it's the title, because it's just why I love the movies. I was trying to think too hard of a movie or of a title of the video series that could, that could stick with people, but it ended up just sounding really corny and cheesy. Like the first one was the film breakdown, and I went really into depth about like the history of bicycle thieves and stuff, and I'm like, I don't want to do that for every movie that I do in this series. And then I'm like, fantastic classics, but then I'm like, that just sounds way too cheesy, so I'm just sticking with why I love. Today's episode is on the 1960 French film directed by Jean-Luc Godard, and that is Breathless. This is one of my top 15 favorite movies of all time, I believe, and it is just so amazing. And obviously I'm going to be gushing super hard about this movie for who knows how long. These are basically unscripted videos, so we'll see what happens. So starting off with Godard just as a director, this was actually my first movie from him, and I think it was a great introduction. While it is very strong in his style, it wasn't too out of the sort of normal, way of making movies to where it was super jarring, but it was different enough where I noticed that he was staying away from these sort of typical conventions of filmmaking. Now, that is one of the main things about Godard as a director that a lot of people see as his kind of differentiating factor and what makes him different and special as a filmmaker and as an artist, because he is someone who wasn't afraid to break out of the boundaries that other people had set for filmmaking, right? Like, there are no set in stone boundaries to what you can do with filmmaking, but everyone was kind of sticking to what works. And if you don't know, Godard was actually a writer for, I think it was called Le Cahier du Cinéma, which in French roughly translates to, just like a film sort of criticism, the film book or whatever. I haven't taken French in a while, but regardless, he was a film critic, and basically what he did was he saw the movies that were being made, he saw the pattern that I am seeing, and that they're all somewhat similar to an extent, and said, I don't want to make movies like that. Movies are supposed to be, their own art form. They're supposed to have like no limits to what you can make. And so this guy just took every convention of film and just went to hell with it. He said, this is how they make movies. I don't care. And that is something I really admire about him. And that is why I love his style, because in a way it is very pretentious and self-indulgent, because he basically thinks his way of making movies is better than what other people did. But to be completely honest with you, it's something that helps immerse me into the experience. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about the influence of this film, because obviously it was a very influential film, not just in terms of the movie, but in terms of the fact that it was one of, I don't think it was the first, but it's definitely one of the first and most prominent films to start the French New Wave, which, if you don't know much about film history, the French New Wave is quite a big film movement in terms of film history that is very important to movies today. It was very influential, and it was a huge film movement. This was like arguably the biggest movie of the French New Wave. It's up for debate, but I would say this is up there with definitely some of the more popular ones. And sort of the way that the French New Wave worked was the same thing that what Godard was doing. He was kind of breaking out of typical film conventions and filmmaking conventions, and they were kind of just rolling with it. And that is something I really, really love about this sort of French New Wave, and that's why I've been loving Godard's movies, and I just want to get more into this portion of film history. And now with all of that stuff sort of out of the way, I want to start getting into specifics with the film. This is a very, very simplistic story, another sort of trait of the French New Wave of cinema, which is just sort of a simplistic story, sometimes almost no story, with very improvised dialogue and not much script. That is one of the key factors of the French New Wave, and that is something that I really like, because when a story is very down to earth, very, low stakes, if it's done right, I think some of those movies can be absolutely exceptional and focus on characters and performances and even just the filmmaking techniques inside of the movie. If you don't know, without getting into too much spoilers, basically the main character, he kills a cop at the beginning, and it's him with his, girlfriend, and sort of them running away, and just how everything unfolds after that event. It is a very simple story, but it works incredibly well, and it's just something that shouldn't work, but it does. Now getting into some of the characters, I think these characters are pretty strong, and while they're not super deep or nuanced or whatever, I think they definitely do their job. It's something that on the surface you're like, what is this movie, why is it so great? It's like the story is simple, there's not much to it, the characters aren't like amazing, what does this movie have going for it? And to be completely honest, it's hard to make this video because it's really difficult to put into words why I love this movie. I just felt it, and I was like, this is you ever get that feeling when you're watching a movie and you just know you love it, but you kind of just don't really know why? This is sort of one of the ones that is like that, and I can explain sort of reasoning and small bits and pieces, but I can't really say concrete one reason why this movie is so special to me. A huge contributing factor to why I think this movie is so phenomenal is the two lead performances. First from Jean Seberg, who plays Patricia, and the other from Jean-Paul Belmondo, who plays Michel. Both of these lead performances absolutely are commanding and take control of the screen, but even together, it works in a way that really shouldn't. If you have two main performances that both command the screen, you would think that they should clash, but these are two main performances that it works so well that on screen it actually makes them even more commanding when they're together. None of what I'm saying really should make any sense, but I hope you guys know what I'm saying. If they're both alone in a scene, they definitely take command of that scene, but together it works even better when they're kind of bouncing off of one another with their dialogue and banter and stuff, and it works incredibly well. Now there's some specific story elements that really stood out to me for being really unique and something that I probably should have hated, but it really honestly added to the experience. One of the main things being basically the entire second act of the movie is inside Patricia's apartment, and they're just going back and forth talking about stuff and calling people, and there are all sort of quick cuts and jarring cuts that really shouldn't be in the places that they're in. There's like a bunch of editing stuff that are just like quick cut, like really fast, one after the other, and that is one of the main things in this movie that a lot of people might find jarring, is the editing, because there's a lot of cuts where they might not seem necessary, and a lot more cuts than you might think are typical for a film. And that's something I found really fascinating, to pay attention to sort of what they were doing with the editing and kind of why they were doing it, because obviously everything is intentional. They're not just cutting for the sake of cutting. There's obviously a reasoning to all this cutting, and I just said cutting like 50 times. But yeah, I definitely found some reasoning to it, and it's really difficult to explain out of context and with no spoilers. So I'll kind of leave that to you guys if you guys want to go watch the movie, but I will warn you, the editing is something that might be jarring. Also, something I want to talk about is the cinematography in this movie, and I guess for Godard as a whole, because I've seen 3 of his movies thus far, and it's just as good in all 3. His camera movement is very smooth, very slick, and very just appealing and pleasing to the eye. There's a lot of handheld camera work, so it looks like someone's walking, gives it a more realistic feeling, and I just absolutely love that sort of thing, and that's basically all I have to say about the camera work. It's very pleasing to the eye, and it has a more realistic feeling to it, which is, again, another factor to the French New Wave, is sort of a sense of realism. And finally, I want to talk about just sort of the film as a cohesive whole. This is a story that works very well. There's no loose ends. Every loose end is tied up by the end of the story. There's very smooth and quick dialogue and banter between the characters, because at times it seems like they hate each other, but they really don't. And it's just, these two have amazing chemistry and work incredibly well together. I think there's just a way that French is spoken that makes the dialogue so much smoother and makes it more appealing to watch, at least in my opinion. But yeah, that is basically all I have to think about right now. If I have anything significant that I have to say about this movie that I haven't said in this video, I'll try and leave it in like a pinned comment or something so you guys can see that a bit later down the road. But yeah, that is basically it. Breathless is in my top 15 favorite films of all time. I absolutely adore it, and if you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend you go check it out. And those are the reasons why I love Jean-Luc Godard's Breathless.